The psychological foundations of the Afrika Korps defeat, the collapse of the Axis dream in North Africa, was not merely a tactical failure of the Wehrmacht, but a systemic breakdown of a logistical mirage that had sustained the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, for years. By May 13, 1943, the vibrant sands of Tunisia had turned into a vast graveyard of ambition, where approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers found themselves cornered against the Mediterranean Sea. Among these men were elite veterans like Hetman Friedrich Radke, a holder of the Iron Cross First Class, whose internal world was governed by the rigid, monochromatic certainties of National Socialist dogma. These soldiers had been conditioned to believe in the inevitable decay of Western democracies, viewing America as a fractured, mongrel nation incapable of sustaining the industrial or moral fortitude required for total war. However, as the surrender progressed, the sheer scale of the Allied encirclement began to plant the first seeds of cognitive dissonance. The desert fighters, who had once prided themselves on their mobility, were suddenly static, reduced to a mass of humanity awaiting processing by a bureaucratic machine they had been told was inefficient. In the makeshift holding pens of Oran, Algeria, the sensory reality of their situation began to deviate sharply from the propaganda broadcasts of Joseph Goebbels. Instead of the expected cruelty or chaotic mismanagement, the prisoners were met with a clinical, almost terrifyingly efficient American administrative apparatus. The processing of tens of thousands of men daily, complete with rapid medical screenings, vaccinations, and the systematic issuance of Geneva Convention-compliant identity cards, suggested a level of organizational mastery that the German High Command had claimed was unique only to the Reich. This was the first phase of a demolition process that would eventually strip away the layers of indoctrination, replacing them with a cold, undeniable recognition of American logistical supremacy. The Industrial Ocean and the Liberty Ship revelation as the 30,000 prisoners, including Radke and Oberreiter Hansmuir, were marched toward the docks of Oran. They were confronted by a maritime spectacle that defied their understanding of naval production. The horizon was dominated by the silhouettes of Liberty ships, vessels like the SS Robert E. Peary, which had famously been assembled from keel to launch in an incomprehensible 4 days and 15 hours. To a German soldier, whose own nation struggled to produce U-boats under constant bombardment and resource scarcity, the existence of such a fleet was a statistical impossibility. These ships were not sleek warships, but utilitarian monuments to a standardized production line that stretched back to the steel mills of Pennsylvania and the shipyards of California. The journey across the Atlantic in July 1943 served as a floating laboratory of American abundance. Within the hulls of these mass-produced giants, the prisoners experienced a standard of living that made their time as conquerors in Europe look like a period of deprivation. The revelation of the American military ration, white bread, real coffee, and meats served twice daily, was initially dismissed as a desperate propaganda stunt designed to buy their loyalty. However, as the days turned into weeks, the consistency of this abundance became a form of psychological attrition. They observed the American sailors with a mixture of envy and horror as they witnessed the magnificent waste of the U.S. Navy. Steaks half-eaten and discarded, fresh milk poured away simply because it was a day old, and the casual disposal of resources that would have been considered strategic treasures in Berlin. The prisoners began to calculate the mathematics of their defeat not through the loss of territory, but through the weight of the garbage bins on these ships. If a single cargo vessel could afford to waste more food than a German company received in a month, the ideological claim that America was on the verge of collapse was not just a lie. It was a catastrophic miscalculation of reality that signaled the end of the war before they ever reached the American coast. The illumination of the Texas plains and the electric reality on June 4th, 1943, the train carrying Unifitzia Vera Burkhardt and 1,850 veterans of the Afrika Korps pulled on a railroad street in Mexia, Texas, marking the beginning of a spatial and ideological displacement that would redefine their lives. Through the windows of cushioned Pullman coaches, a luxury unthinkable for prisoners of war in any other theater. They looked out upon a landscape that contradicted every tenet of Nazi agrarian and industrial theory. As the clock struck 10 p.m., the Texas plains were not shrouded in the mandatory blackouts that had plunged the Third Reich into a state of permanent nocturnal gloom since 1940. Instead, a brilliant constellation of electric light blazed from every farmhouse, every street corner, and every roadside shop window. To Burkhardt, an electrical engineer who knew that rural electrification in Germany barely reached 20% of farms, this display of energy was a direct assault on his worldview. In a Nazi narrative, America was a decadent wasteland of failed capitalism. Yet here was a rural frontier where electricity flowed as freely and casually as water. The sheer profligacy of the illumination, lights left burning in empty rooms and barns, spoke to a level of power generation that made the combined efforts of the German Ruhr look primitive. The entire population of Mahia had turned out not to jeer or stone the supermen of the Afrika Korps, but to witness their arrival with a sense of quiet, confident curiosity. This absence of hostility was perhaps more jarring than violence would have been. It suggested that the Americans did not fear them because they were so utterly secure in their own material and industrial dominance. The mathematical certainty of Allied victory was being broadcast through the glowing filaments of millions of light bulbs across the American heartland, writing a new history that these soldiers were only beginning to read. The railway yards and the anatomy of American momentum, the journey from the Virginia coast to the deep interior of the American South and West served as a high-speed education in the anatomy of a superpower. As the trains rolled through the massive railway yards of Roanoke and the industrial corridors of Tennessee, prisoners like Heinrich Müller began to perform the grim mental arithmetic of a losing side. Müller observed the automation of the American railroad, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems, and automated coal loaders that allowed a train to be serviced in 30 minutes, a task that would have demanded hours of manual labor and horse-drawn support in the Wehrmacht's logistics chain. Through the panoramic windows of their observation cars, the prisoners watched the passage of the Alcoa aluminum plant, a facility so vast it consumed more electricity than the entire city of Munich to fuel its endless furnaces. They saw the synthetic rubber plants of the Rubbertown complex near Louisville, which had achieved in 18 months of production capacity that the German chemical giant IG Farben had failed to match in a decade of war preparation. The scale of these facilities was matched only by the casual wealth of the laborers who manned them. The German soldiers were mesmerized by the sight of dock workers and factory hands driving their own civilian automobiles to work, a privilege that in Germany was reserved for the highest echelons of the Nazi Party. The promised people's car, Volkswagen, was a ghost in Germany, but in America, the people already owned the means of transportation. This realization that the decadent American worker lived a life of greater material comfort than the master race back home was the final blow to their ideological armor. They were no longer just prisoners of a nation. They were prisoners of a reality that was vastly superior to the one they had been sent to defend. The mechanical symphony of Willow Run and the aviation miracle as the trains continued their rhythmic transit across the industrial heartland of Michigan and Illinois, the German prisoners were confronted with a sight that effectively terminated any lingering hopes of a German aerial recovery: Ford's Willow Run plant. To a Luftwaffe pilot like Hutman Verley, who had been conditioned to believe that American aircraft were flimsy, mass-produced toys, the sheer physical dimensions of this facility, spanning over 2.5 million square feet of floor space, represented an industrial magnitude that was simply incomprehensible. Within these walls, a workforce of 42,000 men and women operated a production line that achieved the impossible: the birth of a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Verley pressed his face against the glass of the Pullman coach, counting 17 bombers in various stages of completion visible from just one side of the factory perimeter. This was not the inferior production he had been promised by the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. This was a high-precision, automated assembly of over 1.5 million individual parts, synchronized by 1,500 subcontractors across 30 states. The plant's appetite for energy was so voracious that it consumed more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. In Germany, the production of a single heavy bomber was a month-long ordeal involving specialized labor and scarce materials. Here, it was a repetitive, unstoppable industrial heartbeat. The realization that America could replace its entire monthly combat losses in just a few days of production at a single plant was the ultimate psychological carpet bombing. The German officers sat in a stunned, heavy silence, watching the silver wings of the liberators glinting in the sun, knowing that no amount of German spirit or Aryan courage could ever compensate for this level of sheer, automated output. The great grain elevators and the logistics of infinite sustenance crossing the Mississippi River over the Eads Bridge in St. Louis. The prisoner's perspective shifted from the industrial to the agricultural, revealing a different but equally devastating form of American power: the logistics of food. Below the bridge, barges moved in endless chains, carrying more grain in a single afternoon than the entire German harvest of 1942. To men like Unratia Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from the rolling hills of Bavaria, the sight of the grain elevators stretching like concrete cathedrals along the riverbanks was a revelation of a breadbasket that could feed the world 10 times over. In Europe, food was a weapon of war, strictly rationed, used to coerce and control populations. In America, it was treated with a casual, almost reckless abundance that Schmidt found both terrifying and mesmerizing. He watched from the train as a single crane operator, casually eating a sandwich thick with meat that exceeded a German citizen's weekly ration, loaded thousands of tons of wheat into a barge. The realization that the Americans transported food with the same urgency and volume that the Wehrmacht used to transport ammunition was a turning point. In Kansas City, the train halted near a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle waited, a sea of beef that filled the air with the scent of an industrial-scale slaughterhouse. Prisoners who had subsisted on meager portions of horse meat or sawdust-heavy bread in the desert watched American yard workers throwing away scraps of beef during their lunch breaks. "They eat meat like we wished we could eat bread," recorded Paul Fisher in his diary. This was not a nation on the brink of collapse. This was a nation whose primary logistical problem was not scarcity, but the management of an overwhelming surplus. The construction of Camp Hearn and the standard of enemy dignity, the arrival at the permanent POW camps, such as Camp Hearn in the sun-baked plains of Texas, provided the final stage of the material demolition of Nazi ideology. Built in a staggering 4-month period, Camp Hearn was not a collection of drafty, makeshift shacks, but a meticulously planned community designed to house nearly 5,000 men in conditions that exceeded the civilian standards of many European cities. The barracks were constructed with more high-quality lumber than entire German villages possessed, equipped with electric lighting, steam heat, and modern plumbing that included hot showers and flush toilets. To the German soldiers, who had spent the last 3 years in the dust of North Africa or the ruins of occupied Europe, the camp looked less like a prison and more like a modern military academy. The camp hospital, under the observation of Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, was a facility that would have been the envy of any civilian medical center in the Reich. It was stocked with X-ray machines, advanced surgical suites, and an endless supply of pharmaceutical drugs, most notably penicillin, the miracle drug that had been a whispered rumor in German medical circles. The fact that the Americans were willing to use their most advanced medical technology on enemy soldiers was a profound moral shock. It suggested a nation that was not only industrially superior, but possessed a moral confidence so absolute that it could afford to be merciful. The camp kitchen, with its walk-in refrigerators and industrial electric mixers, became a daily reminder of the decadent democracy's power. When Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef, saw the 10% surplus requirement for daily rations, meaning that perfectly good food was discarded to ensure every man was full, he wept at the contrast between American waste and the starving families he had left behind in Munich. The labor program and the revelation of the American heartland by the late summer of 1943 As the labor shortage in the United States intensified, the prisoners were transitioned from the confines of the camps into the fields and factories of the American interior, a move that exposed them to the full, unvarnished reality of American life. Under the Geneva Convention, they were prohibited from direct war work, but they were permitted to labor in agriculture and civilian manufacturing, effectively freeing American men for the front lines. This technicality allowed thousands of Germans to work alongside American civilians, witnessing a society that functioned at a level of efficiency and social cohesion they had been told was impossible. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unratia Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in an hour than his entire village in Germany could have managed in a month of manual labor. The farmer who owned the gin was a common man, not an aristocrat or a party official. Yet he owned a truck, a tractor, a car, and a home with running water and a refrigerator. The sight of diverse workforces, including Black Americans and women, operating complex machinery with high proficiency shattered the racial and social hierarchies of National Socialism. In the sugar beet fields of Nebraska, the prisoners witnessed the mechanization of the soul, where a single combine harvester did the work of 100 men. The casual wealth of the American laborer who smoked cigarettes continuously and drank bottled Coca-Cola while operating heavy equipment was the ultimate evidence that the Nazi New Order was an impoverished shadow of the American reality. Every farm, every mill, and every small-town shop was a silent witness against the lies of the Reich, proving that prosperity was the product of freedom and technology, not conquest and slavery. The technological superiority of domestic production and the magnificent waste. As the winter of 1943 approached, the German prisoners were no longer just observers of American heavy industry. They were witnesses to the logistical and social intricacies of a society that could afford to be both immensely powerful and casually wasteful. At food processing plants like the Campbell Soup facility in New Jersey, prisoners like Ernst Vanner, who had managed a canning factory in Germany, saw the true face of American automation. In the Reich, food processing was a labor-intensive, often frantic endeavor hampered by equipment shortages and strict government quotas. In America, Vanner observed a skeleton crew composed mostly of elderly men and women who managed a mechanical assembly that processed more tomatoes in 24 hours than his entire district in Berlin could handle in a month. This was a symphony of steel and electricity where every movement was optimized. The presence of electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, and massive high-pressure steam cookers, all controlled by a single worker who could sit comfortably and listen to the radio, was a psychological blow. It highlighted the vast gap in human capital and mechanical investment. The prisoners noted that the Americans left lights burning in empty buildings and kept electric fans running in vacant rooms. This magnificent waste, as Heinrich Müller described it, was the ultimate strategic proof of a nation that possessed infinite resources. To a mind shaped by the scarcity of a German home front, where every scrap of metal and every watt of power was tracked by the Gestapo, this carelessness was more intimidating than any military parade. It indicated that America was not even exerting its full effort to fight the war. It was winning while maintaining a standard of civilian luxury that the master race had never achieved even at peace. The humanitarian assault and the demolition of racial mythology, the most profound and unexpected phase of the prisoner's transformation, came not from the sight of factories, but from the experience of American humanity, which acted as a corrosive acid against the rigid structures of Nazi racial theory. Despite the intense propaganda that had depicted Americans as a mongrelized and soulless people, the German POWs discovered a population that was secure enough in its own strength to treat its enemies with a shocking degree of dignity and individual empathy. When the Red Cross delivered news of personal tragedies from Germany, such as the death of a family member in an Allied bombing raid, the American camp commanders did not respond with the cold indifference common in the Wehrmacht. Instead, they often delivered the news personally, offering genuine condolences and even facilitating spiritual support through camp chaplains. One of the most striking examples was the intervention of American civic and church groups who, upon learning that the wives and children of certain prisoners were starving in the ruins of German cities, sent food and care packages directly to enemy civilians. This act of Christian charity toward the families of men who were actively trying to kill American soldiers shattered the ideological foundation of the total war mindset. The distinction the Americans made, that they were at war with a Nazi regime and not the German people, was a concept that many prisoners initially viewed with suspicion but eventually embraced as a superior moral reality. The sight of diverse communities in small Texas and Nebraska towns, where people of different backgrounds worked together in a functional, democratic harmony, exposed the Nazi obsession with racial purity as a primitive and self-defeating delusion. The Christmas of 1943 and the Feast of Revelation, December 1943, marked a watershed moment in the psychological history of the German POW experience, as the holiday season was utilized as a powerful, non-coercive tool of cultural diplomacy. While the German army on the Eastern Front was freezing and starving in the ruins of Stalingrad, the prisoners in camps like Herne and Shelby were treated to a display of generosity that defied their comprehension of wartime reality. Across the United States, American families, churches, and even the Boy Scouts coordinated to send over 500,000 Christmas packages to the enemy in their midst. These boxes, filled with tobacco, chocolates, luxury toiletries, and handmade cards, were not just gifts. They were evidence of a society so affluent that it could afford to care for its prisoners better than the German state cared for its own soldiers. The Christmas feast itself was a culinary demolition of Nazi propaganda. Thousands of prisoners sat down to traditional American dinners of turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, and pies in quantities that had not been seen in Germany since the early 1930s. "We ate like kings," recorded Feldwebel Hansa, noting that the meal was not a special performance for the cameras, but the standard holiday fare of the average American family. The presence of local church choirs singing German carols outside the camp wire, and the arrival of homemade cookies from local women whose own sons were fighting in the Pacific was a moral offensive that the prisoners could not resist. It revealed a culture of true power, a power that did not need to be cruel to be effective. By the time the last carol faded, the ideological grip of National Socialism had been broken for tens of thousands of men, replaced by a deep-seated curiosity about the democratic system that produced such a peculiar and prosperous people. The intellectual awakening and the thirst for democratic knowledge by early 1944, the ideological collapse syndrome identified by American intelligence, had evolved into a massive intellectual migration as prisoners began to actively seek out the education and culture of their captors. This shift was facilitated by the Special Projects Division, which provided access to a vast array of reading materials, from American newspapers and magazines to classic literature that had been banned by the Reich. For the first time in over a decade, German men were allowed to read multiple, conflicting viewpoints on history, politics, and science without the fear of the secret police. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable. Over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in correspondence courses provided by top-tier institutions like the University of Chicago and Stanford. They studied English, American history, and the mechanics of constitutional government, not because they were forced to, but because they had seen the physical results of these ideas in the world around them. The camp newspapers, such as Der Ruf, transformed from nationalist bulletins into sophisticated forums for debating the future of a post-war democratic Germany. They watched Hollywood films not as mindless entertainment, but as windows into a society that practiced self-criticism and open dialogue, concepts that were revolutionary to a generation raised under the Führer principle. Even high-ranking officers and scientists, like Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, found themselves attending lectures led by American professors, some of whom were Jewish refugees who had fled Germany years earlier. The fact that these scholars taught their former enemies with academic rigor and without personal malice was a final, devastating proof of the superiority of a free society. The prisoners realized that they had been led by criminals and liars, and they began to see their captivity as a form of liberation, an opportunity to learn the skills necessary to rebuild their shattered homeland from the ashes of defeat. The final demolition of the Nazi psyche occurred not through prosperity, but through the stark, harrowing light of moral accountability that arrived in the spring of 1945. When the news of the Normandy invasion first reached the camps, it triggered a wave of disbelief that quickly surrendered to the cold logic of logistics. The prisoners watched newsreels of 6,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft, an armada that exceeded the entire capacity of the European continent. However, the true zero hour for their souls came when American forces liberated the concentration camps within Germany. The footage of Buchenwald and Dachau was screened in POW camp theaters across America, and for many, the initial instinct was to cry propaganda. But as letters arrived from their own families in Germany confirming the horrors, the psychological impact was catastrophic. Men who had maintained a shred of pride in the honor of the Wehrmacht now faced the realization that they had been the specialized tools of a criminal enterprise. As Hedman Walter Schmidt eloquently recorded, they discovered that while they believed they were bringing civilization to inferior peoples, they were actually the barbarians in the eyes of the world. This moral vacuum was immediately filled by the American re-education program, which shifted its focus toward the practical reconstruction of Germany. The prisoners were taught about the Marshall Plan and democratic governance, transforming from defeated soldiers into the future architects of the Federal Republic. The success of this transformation is reflected in the extraordinary statistics of the post-war era. Of the 371,683 German prisoners repatriated, the vast majority returned home not as bitter losers, but as missionaries for the democratic model they had observed in the American heartland. The escape rate during the war had remained a statistically insignificant 0.6%, a testament to the fact that most prisoners found their captivity to be an upgrade in dignity and resource. The legacy of these camps is found in the economic miracle of the 1950s. Former prisoners like Hans Kroll and Walter Hallstein rose to become ambassadors and leaders of the European Commission, applying the lessons of American industrial efficiency and democratic cooperation to build a new, peaceful Europe. The emotional climax of this 40-year journey took place in 1985 in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to the United States, not as captives, but as friends and business partners, many bringing their children to see the land that had saved them from their own ideology. At the reunion dinner, former Oberleutnant Hermann Gutz delivered a keynote that resonated with the spirit of the entire experience. He thanked America for winning the war not just with bombs, but with the simple, overwhelming evidence of a free society's capacity to create.